What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a routine morning show interview, only to find himself in the crosshairs of one of television's most aggressive legal minds? The tension in the Good Morning America studio was thick enough to cut with a knife, as Denzel Washington shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unprepared for what was about to unfold. This wasn't going to be your typical feel-good celebrity chat, and everyone in that studio was about to witness television history in the making. Make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe how this explosive confrontation escalated. The morning started like any other, at the Good Morning America studios in Times Square. Denzel Washington had arrived early for his scheduled interview to promote his latest directorial project, a passion piece he'd been developing for over a decade. The two-time Academy Award winner was known for his professionalism and thoughtful interviews, rarely if ever causing controversy during his media appearances. However, what none of the production team anticipated was that co-host Sunny Hostin had spent the previous evening diving deep into research that would change the entire trajectory of the interview. As the cameras rolled and the familiar Good Morning America theme music faded, Robin Roberts offered her usual warm welcome to viewers before introducing the legendary actor. "We're joined now by the incomparable Denzel Washington," she began with her trademark smile. "Denzel, it's always a pleasure to have you here with us." Washington nodded graciously, settling into the plush interview chair as the studio lights created that familiar television glow. "Thank you for having me, Robin. It's great to be back." The first few minutes proceeded exactly as expected. Robin Roberts asked about his latest film, his approach to directing, and his thoughts on the current state of Hollywood. Washington's responses were measured, thoughtful, and delivered with the kind of gravitas that had made him one of the most respected figures in entertainment. The audience was clearly enjoying the conversation, and even the production crew seemed relaxed as they monitored the smooth flow of the segment. But then Sunny Hostin leaned forward in her chair, her legal background evident in the way she studied Washington's responses. There was something in her expression that suggested she wasn't satisfied with the surface-level pleasantries that had dominated the interview thus far. She had been unusually quiet during the opening segment, which anyone familiar with her interviewing style would recognize as uncharacteristic. "Denzel, if I may," Hostin interjected, her voice carrying a tone that immediately shifted the energy in the room. "I want to ask you about something that I think our viewers deserve to hear your perspective on. End of 5. Washington's eyebrows raised slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Of course, Sunny. What's on your mind?" "Well, there's been quite a bit of discussion recently about representation in Hollywood, and specifically about actors and directors who've achieved your level of success and influence," Hostin began, her words carefully chosen but loaded with implication. "I'm curious about your thoughts on the responsibility that comes with that platform." The question seemed innocuous enough on the surface, but there was something in Hostin's delivery that suggested she was building towards something more substantial. Washington nodded thoughtfully, clearly considering his response. "I think anyone who has been blessed with success in this industry, or really in any field, has a responsibility to use their platform thoughtfully," Washington replied. "I've always tried to be conscious of the projects I choose and the messages they send." Hostin wasn't satisfied with that response. She leaned forward even further, her journalist instincts clearly engaged. "That's interesting that you mention being conscious of the messages your projects send, because I've been looking at some of your recent choices, and I have to say, I'm struggling to see the consistency in that philosophy." The atmosphere in the studio began to change noticeably. Robin Roberts, sensing the shift, attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Well, Denzel certainly has had an incredible range of roles over his career," she offered diplomatically. But Hostin wasn't backing down. "No, Robin, I think this is important. Denzel, your last 3 films have all featured you in roles where you're either fighting against or completely separate from issues that directly impact the Black community. Meanwhile, you've been relatively silent on several major social justice issues that have dominated headlines. How do you reconcile that with your stated commitment to conscious messaging?" Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled. "I think that's a rather narrow interpretation of my work and my public statements, Sunny. I've never claimed to be a spokesperson for any particular cause or community. Haven't you, though? Hostin shot back, her legal training evident in her rapid response. Because I have quotes here from interviews you've given, where you specifically talk about the importance of black actors taking on roles that inspire and uplift. Yet your recent work seems to completely contradict that philosophy. The tension was now palpable throughout the studio. Camera operators exchanged glances, and the production team could be seen frantically communicating through their headsets. This was clearly not the direction anyone had expected the interview to take, and Washington's media team, watching from the green room, were undoubtedly starting to panic. I think you're mischaracterizing both my statements and my work, Washington responded, his voice carrying the first hint of irritation. The roles I choose are based on the quality of the story, the depth of the character, and the overall artistic merit of the project. I don't select roles based on some predetermined agenda. Hostin had clearly done her homework, and she wasn't about to let Washington off the hook. But isn't that exactly the problem? When you have the kind of influence you have, when young black actors look up to you as a role model, doesn't your choice to prioritize what you call artistic merit over social impact send a message in itself? What message do you think it sends? Washington asked, his tone becoming noticeably cooler. I think it sends the message that once you reach a certain level of success, you can afford to ignore the struggles of your community, Hostin replied without hesitation. I think it sends the message that artistic integrity is more important than social responsibility. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Washington's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His entire demeanor shifted, and for the first time in the interview, his carefully maintained composure began to crack. That's a hell of an accusation to make on live television, Washington said, his voice low but clearly agitated. Robin Roberts immediately attempted damage control. I think what Sunny is trying to get at is the broader conversation about celebrity responsibility in today's climate, she offered, but both Washington and Hostin seemed to barely acknowledge her attempt at mediation. No, Robin, Hostin continued, her legal background making her comfortable with confrontation in a way that most entertainment journalists would never be. I'm talking about something very specific. I'm talking about a pattern of choices that suggests Mr. Washington has become disconnected from the very community that supported him throughout his rise to stardom. Washington leaned back in his chair, studying Hostin with the intensity of an actor preparing for a dramatic scene. You know what, Sunny? You're absolutely right. Let's talk about patterns. Let's talk about your pattern of using this platform to ambush guests with loaded questions, designed to create controversy rather than facilitate genuine conversation. The silence that followed Washington's counterattack was deafening. Even the usually bustling Good Morning America studio seemed to hold its collective breath as Sunny Hostin processed what had just happened. She had clearly expected to maintain control of this line of questioning, but Washington had just flipped the script in a way that caught everyone off guard. Hostin's eyes narrowed, and her legal instincts kicked into high gear. Excuse me? She said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. Are you suggesting that holding public figures accountable for their choices is somehow inappropriate journalism? I'm suggesting that there's a difference between journalism and prosecution, Washington replied, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his defense. And right now, it feels like I'm sitting in a courtroom, rather than on a morning talk show. Robin Roberts could sense the interview spiraling completely out of control. The producers were undoubtedly screaming in her earpiece, but she knew from experience that sometimes the best approach was to let the conflict play out rather than try to artificially contain it. Television gold was being created in real time, and everyone in the studio knew it. Denzel, I think you're being overly defensive about some very legitimate questions. Hostin pressed on, clearly not intimidated by Washington's pushback. The fact that you're uncomfortable discussing your social responsibility suggests that maybe there's some truth to what I'm saying. Uncomfortable? Washington let out a short, bitter laugh. Sunny, I've been acting professionally for over 4 decades. I've been in rooms with some of the most powerful people in the world. I've testified before Congress about arts funding. I've spoken at the Kennedy Center Honors. What makes you think a morning show host with a law degree makes me uncomfortable? The insult was subtle but unmistakable, and Hostin's reaction was immediate. Her posture straightened, and her voice took on the prosecutorial tone that viewers of The View knew all too well. A morning show host with a law degree? She repeated, her words dripping with controlled fury. Is that really how you want to characterize a Harvard-educated attorney who spent years covering social justice issues for major networks? I'm characterizing someone who seems more interested in creating conflict than understanding nuance, Washington shot back. You asked me about my recent film choices. Did you actually watch them, or did you just read the plot summaries and decide they didn't meet your criteria for appropriate black cinema? Hostin reached for a folder that had been sitting beside her chair throughout the interview. Actually, I did watch them, all three of them. And I have to say, I was particularly troubled by your decision to take on a role in a film that essentially glorifies a character who abandons his community for personal gain. Which film are you referring to? Washington asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I think you know exactly which one, Hostin replied. The one where you play a successful businessman who moves to an affluent white suburb and spends the entire movie explaining to his family why they need to assimilate rather than maintain their cultural identity. Washington was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. That character's journey is about the complexity of success and the difficult choices people make when they're trying to provide better opportunities for their children. If you watched the film and came away thinking it was about abandoning one's community, then perhaps you missed the deeper themes the story was exploring. Or perhaps, Hostin countered, you're so removed from the struggles of ordinary black families that you can't see how a story like that plays to harmful stereotypes about success requiring cultural assimilation. The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Washington's eyes flashed with genuine anger for the first time in the interview. Removed from the struggles of ordinary black families? He repeated, his voice rising slightly. Do you know where I came from, Sunny? Do you know anything about my background beyond what your research team printed out for you this morning? I know you grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, in a middle-class household with two parents who prioritized education and discipline. Hostin replied without missing a beat. I know you attended private school and had opportunities that many black children don't have access to. And what exactly does that prove? Washington demanded. That because my parents worked hard to provide me with opportunities, I'm somehow less qualified to speak about the black experience in America? It proves that your perspective is shaped by privilege, Hostin said, her voice steady and sure. And privilege has a way of creating blind spots, especially when it comes to understanding how your choices impact people who don't have the same advantages you've had. Robin Roberts finally found an opening to interject. I think both of you are making valid points here. But perhaps we can discuss this without questioning each other's authenticity or qualifications. Both Washington and Hostin turned to look at her, but neither seemed particularly interested in her attempt at mediation. The confrontation had taken on a life of its own, and both participants were clearly invested in seeing it through to its conclusion. No, Robin, I think Sunny wants to have this conversation, so let's have it, Washington said, turning his full attention back to Hostin. You want to talk about privilege and blind spots? Let's talk about the privilege of sitting on national television and questioning someone's connection to their community based on career choices you fundamentally misunderstand. I understand perfectly, Hostin replied coldly. I understand that when someone reaches your level of fame and fortune, it becomes very easy to lose sight of the responsibility that comes with that platform. I understand that success can insulate you from the reality that most black Americans face every day. Success can insulate you, Washington agreed, his voice taking on a more philosophical tone. But so can sanctimony. So can the belief that your perspective is the only valid one. So can the arrogance that comes with thinking you have the right to judge how other people choose to use their gifts. The camera caught Hostin's slight flinch at the word sanctimony, but she recovered quickly. This isn't about judgment, Denzel. This is about accountability. When you have millions of people who look up to you, who see you as a representation of what's possible, your choices matter beyond your personal artistic satisfaction. And who appointed you the arbiter of how I should use my platform? Washington asked, his voice gaining intensity. Who gave you the authority to determine whether my choices are sufficiently conscious or socially responsible? The same people who gave you your platform in the first place, Hostin fired back. The black community that supported your films, bought your tickets, and made you one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. Don't you think you owe them something more than characters who run away from their roots? Washington leaned forward in his chair, His eyes locked on Hostin's. I owe them my best work. I owe them honest portrayals of complex characters dealing with real human dilemmas. I owe them the respect to not reduce their experiences to simple political messaging or social media-friendly soundbites. That's a convenient way to avoid taking any real stand on anything, Hostin observed. When everything is complex and nuanced, you never have to commit to a position that might be controversial or challenging. And when everything is reduced to political litmus tests, you never have to engage with the actual art or the actual human truths the work is trying to explore, Washington countered. Tell me, Sunny, in your analysis of my recent films, did you consider the performances, the direction, the cinematography, the writing? Or did you just check them against your list of approved social justice themes? The question clearly struck a nerve, because Hostin's response was more heated than anything she had said previously. Don't you dare suggest that I can't appreciate artistic merit. I'm not some cultural Philistine who judges art solely on its political content. But I also don't hide behind claims of artistic integrity when the real issue is courage. Courage? Washington repeated, his eyebrows raised in obvious surprise. Yes, courage, Hostin confirmed. The courage to use your influence to actually challenge systems of oppression, instead of making movies that let white audiences feel comfortable about racial inequality because the black characters eventually find ways to fit into broaden existing power structures. The word courage hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon, and Washington's reaction was immediate and explosive. His carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely, and the anger that had been building throughout the interview erupted in full force. Courage, Washington said, his voice rising to a level that made everyone in the studio freeze. You want to lecture me about courage? You want to sit there in your comfortable chair, with your comfortable salary, working for a network owned by Disney, and tell me I don't have the courage to challenge systems of oppression? Hostin didn't back down an inch. If the shoe fits, Denzel, when was the last time you took on a project that actually challenged white supremacy instead of reinforcing it? When was the last time you used your platform to speak truth to power instead of telling stories that make oppression palatable? You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, Washington shot back, his voice now carrying a level of intensity that was genuinely intimidating. No idea whatsoever. You think courage is making speeches on television? You think courage is asking gotcha questions during interviews? Real courage is spending your own money to make films that nobody wants to fund because they're too honest about American history. Then where are those films? Hostin demanded. Where are these brutally honest projects you're funding with your own money? Because what I see are safe choices. Commercial films that don't threaten anyone's worldview. Washington stood up abruptly, and for a moment it looked like he might actually walk off the set. The camera operators quickly adjusted their angles to follow his movement, while Robin Roberts sat frozen, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. You know what, I'm done with this, Washington said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. I came here to talk about my work, not to be lectured by someone who thinks she understands my life and my choices better than I do. Sit down, Denzel, Hostin said firmly, her legal training evident in her ability to remain calm under pressure. You can walk away from this conversation, but you can't walk away from the questions I'm raising. And your reaction right now is proving my point better than anything I could say. What point is that? Washington demanded, though he remained standing. That you're not used to being challenged, Hostin replied. That you've surrounded yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear for so long, that you can't handle an honest conversation about your impact and your choices. Washington's laugh was harsh and bitter. Honest conversation? Is that what you call this ambush? This character assassination disguised as journalism? I call it holding you accountable, Hostin said, her voice steady as a rock. Something that clearly doesn't happen to you very often anymore. Robin Roberts finally found her voice. Denzel, please, let's all take a breath here and try to find some common ground. Common ground? Washington turned to look at her, his expression incredulous. Robin, your colleague just spent the last 15 minutes questioning my integrity, my authenticity, and my connection to my own community. She's accused me of being a sellout, of lacking courage, and of reinforcing white supremacy. What exactly is the common ground there? The common ground, Hostin interjected, is that we both care about the Black community and we both want to see positive representation in media. We just disagree about what that looks like. No, Washington said, shaking his head emphatically. Don't you dare try to frame this as a disagreement about representation. This is about you deciding that you have the right to judge how I live my life and use my talents. This is about your arrogance in thinking that your vision of what Black success should look like is the only valid one. And this is about your refusal to acknowledge that with great privilege comes great responsibility. Hostin fired back. You have influence that most people can only dream of, and you're using it to make movies that reinforce the very systems that oppress people who look like us. People who look like us, Washington repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That's rich, coming from someone who went to Harvard Law School and works for one of the biggest media corporations in the world. Tell me, Sunny, when was the last time you spent time in the communities you claim to speak for? When was the last time you walked through the neighborhoods where people are actually struggling instead of talking about their struggles from a television studio? The accusation clearly hit home, because Hostin's composure wavered for the first time in the interview. My background doesn't invalidate my concerns about your choices, she said, but there was a defensive edge to her voice that hadn't been there before. Doesn't it? Washington pressed. Because it seems to me like you're just as removed from those communities as you claim I am. The difference is, I don't pretend to be their spokesperson. I'm not pretending to be anyone's spokesperson, Hostin replied, her voice rising slightly. I'm using my platform to ask difficult questions that need to be asked. No, you're using your platform to grandstand, Washington said bluntly. You're using my appearance on this show to score political points with viewers who already agree with you. This isn't journalism, it's performance. The studio had become completely silent except for the voices of the two combatants. Even the usually busy production crew had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. This was clearly unlike anything that had ever happened on Good Morning America before. If this is performance, Hostin said, her voice now carrying a dangerous edge, then you're giving the performance of your career right now. The angry Black man who can't handle being questioned by a Black woman. Is that really the image you want to leave with our viewers? The words hit Washington like a physical blow, and his reaction was immediate and furious. How dare you? He said, his voice low and menacing. How dare you try to reduce this to some stereotype about angry Black men? You have been attacking me personally for the past 20 minutes, questioning my character, my integrity, and my connection to my community, and when I respond with legitimate anger, you try to use that anger against me. I'm pointing out the irony, Hostin said, seemingly unfazed by Washington's intensity. You claim to make complex, nuanced films about the Black experience, but when faced with complex, nuanced questions about your choices, you resort to anger and defensiveness. You know what? Washington said, his voice suddenly calm in a way that was somehow more unsettling than his anger had been. You're absolutely right. I am angry. I'm angry that I have to sit here and defend my life's work to someone who has decided that artistic integrity and social responsibility are mutually exclusive. I'm angry that you think you have the right to determine whether my choices are sufficiently Black enough for your approval. He paused, looking directly into the camera for the first time since the confrontation began. But mostly, I'm angry that viewers are watching this and thinking this is what productive dialogue about race and representation looks like. Because it's not. This is what happens when ideology trumps understanding, when politics becomes more important than art, and when people care more about being right than being thoughtful. Washington turned back to Hostin, his expression hard as stone. So congratulations, Sunny. You got your viral moment. You got your confrontation. You got to challenge the big Hollywood star on live television. I hope it was worth it. With that, Washington began removing his microphone, his intentions clear to everyone in the studio. Robin Roberts made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Denzel, please, let's not end things this way. Perhaps we can find a way to continue this conversation in a more constructive manner. But Washington was already standing, his microphone pack disconnected and placed on his chair. There's nothing constructive about this conversation, Robin. And I won't be a part of turning serious issues into television spectacle. He looked one last time at Hostin, who sat watching him with an expression that was difficult to read. You want to know what courage looks like, Sunny? Sometimes courage is knowing when to walk away from a fight that serves no purpose except to feed someone else's ego. And with those words, Denzel Washington walked off the Good Morning America set, leaving behind one of the most explosive television moments in recent memory. As the cameras continued to roll and the studio sat in stunned silence, viewers across the country had just witnessed something unprecedented, a Hollywood legend refusing to be backed into a corner, even if it meant ending his interview in the most dramatic way possible. The confrontation raised important questions about celebrity responsibility, the role of media in holding public figures accountable, and the complex dynamics of race and success in America. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that even the most respectful and professional public figures have their breaking point when pushed too far. What do you think? Was Sunny Hostin right to press Denzel Washington so aggressively about his choices, or did she cross the line from journalism into personal attack? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories like this one.